Absolutely. We want to make sure that every Minnesotan has basic coverage care. But when we create a system where the essential health benefits are such that everybody's being demanded that they have some sort of a B&W plan, it's too much. We can't afford it. So right now we have an awful lot of people, 5 to 10% of the population don't have insurance. But we have a whole another big chunk of people that do have insurance, but the deductibles and the co-insurances and the co-pays are so much they can't use it.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Let's go over to Justin Betty with Valley News Live.
Thanks, Dan. A recent decision by the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, no longer guaranteeing women the right to an abortion nationwide, leaving it up to states. Our station's right on the border of Fargo, North Dakota, and Moorhead, Minnesota. So in North Dakota, abortion could and is expected to soon become illegal in most cases under a trigger law. In Minnesota, abortion is still protected under the state constitution, Roe v. Gomez, but that could change. So the question is, what, if anything, would you do to change abortion law? We begin with Dr. Jensen.
In Minnesota, abortion is a constitutionally protected right. And the only way that really feasibly gets changed is through some sort of an amendment ballot. And that would mean that 4 million Minnesotans would have the chance to decide where Minnesota comes down in this position. But because, and I think Tim Walz has said this, as has Keith Ellison and numerous legal experts that I've talked with, because in Minnesota abortion is a legally protected right, it is not on the ballot in November. What is on the ballot in November is, without question, skyrocketing inflation, crime out of control, and our kids aren't getting the education that we think they need. As governor, I won't ban abortion. I can't. As Governor Walz has said, no governor can, no politician can. But I do want to say this. As governor, I absolutely want to come alongside of women, and I want to support and protect them. This is our opportunity. We need to do more. We need to share the responsibility and the challenge of planning families and planning pregnancies. I think we should have birth control pills over the counter. I think we should have a $10 maximum per month. I believe we should have paid maternity health benefits when moms have babies. And I think we should streamline adoption proceedings, and we should have a tax credit associated with it. I also would like to see us stiffen the penalties for those crimes that target women, such as carjacking and rape. But abortion clearly is not on the ballot in November.
Thank you,
Dr.
Dr.
Anything said
Jensen.
to the contrary is just fear-mongering.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Well, there's a clear contrast here. My entire career, I've trusted women to make their health care decisions. I don't believe anybody who sits in this office should come between them. Scott was very clear in May. He mocked me and said, "No kidding, Sherlock. I'm running for governor to get things done. We're going to ban abortion. That's not news." That changed after Roe versus Wade. And I think what most of us know, again, you heard this go to many different places. This is not about trusting women. It's not about holding clear convictions. It's about changing your positions as the winds blow. This is about life and death. This is about providers making the most personal decisions with a woman with nobody else in between them. I've made it very clear in every single thing I've done. I didn't have to practice 40 years of medicine to change the positions on women's health care in the final weeks once we saw how unpopular this was. So what I'd speak to Minnesotans on this, being governor means making hard decisions. Doesn't mean you're always going to get them right, but it means trusting Minnesotans. So let's just be very clear. The governors appoint Supreme Court justices who interpret cases and come from front of them. We heard Supreme Court justices go in front of the United States Senate and claim that there was no way Roe versus Wade would change because it was settled law. Well, fool us once. It's not going to happen here in Minnesota. I just want to be absolutely clear. This is on the ballot. It will impact generations to come, and I have been absolutely clear from the beginning of this. Not on our watch. I trust women. I trust them to make their own health care decisions.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Let's go to Stacy Steinhagen with KEYC News Now.
Many of our viewers have reached out about the ongoing opioid crisis affecting communities big and small. According to the Minnesota Department of Health, nearly 1,300 people in this state died last year from an overdose. That is up 20% from 2020. Now, rainbow fentanyl pills, looking like candy, have reached Minnesota. Authorities first finding the brightly colored fentanyl, which could appeal to kids, in Mankato last month. As governor, what specifically would you do to address this ongoing crisis and save lives? The question going to Governor Walz first.
Yeah, the opioid crisis, and it continued to accelerate. We've seen this in Minnesota. It's even disproportionately hits our communities of color, especially our indigenous communities. Certainly the idea of stopping them at the border, but there's a lot of things that we can do on the front end, making sure that we're stopping that demand, making sure that we have the services available. I want to say one thing I'm really proud of in Minnesota. Minnesota was one of the states that sued the manufacturers who were making this. This opioid pandemic started, and some of you have seen the shows, you've seen the documentaries that have been done on this, that they started pushing these things for profit and ended up spreading into our communities. That's where most of this has come from. And I have to say, I want to be very clear about this. They didn't do it alone. When Scott was issuing opioid prescriptions, he issued more than 94% of his peers. He did that at the same time while accepting meals from the manufacturers and the pharmaceutical companies, whining and dining on expensive meals. And then he did an expose that was in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune that was entitled Confessions of a Prescription Drug Pusher, where Scott acknowledged that their impact on him and marketing impacted his prescribing of those. It's getting at the front end of this. It's understanding why it got it out there. It's doing what the state of Minnesota did, suing, and then putting in processes to both capture the opioids before they get there and working with folks who are in recovery. Minnesota can do that.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
Without question, the fentanyl that plagues us today is taking a tremendous number of lives. I think over 100,000 drug overdose deaths in 2021, and 2/3 of those were fentanyl. In the 1980s and the 1990s, there was absolutely a heavy-duty pharma push to encourage physicians to use more narcotics and opiates. We actually had another vital sign, which was the pain management level. What's your pain level, 1 through 10? And if we didn't ask that, we weren't, quote, doing good medicine. So I don't disagree with Tim Walz that physicians and the healthcare system have contributed to the problems. And in terms of going out to dinner and having an educational event, yeah, that could happen as well. But I think the important thing is going forward, we need to stop the supply of fentanyl coming from across the southern border. And I don't think Tim Walz has been an advocate of tightening up the southern border. He's been loose on that, if you will. But I also think that it's interesting to me that he's willing to go out and sue drug companies, which I'm okay with, but he's not willing to go out and take action like that when we're losing $250 million in the Feeding Our Future fraud. In this situation, we had a clear situation where Governor Walz learned of the fact that there was fraud going on. We still can't pin him down as to whether it was April or the summer or November, but the fact is he broke the law by not advising the Office of the Legislative Auditor that there was likely fraud going on.
Thank you, Dr.
Governor
Jensen.
Walz broke the law.
Thank
We'll
you.
be addressing fraud later.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later here in the debate. On now to one of our short answer questions. You'll each have 30 seconds to answer this. Minnesota is surrounded by states that have legalized sports gambling, but some of them have not legalized it on mobile platforms. In 30 seconds, will you push for legalized sports gambling and the ability to bet via mobile devices? Dr. Jensen, you have 30 seconds to answer.
I would say yes and yes. I would support sports betting and mobilized platforms is fine. I do think that it's important to realize, though, that we need to do this in an effort to secure funding for meaningful programs. We cannot, if we move in this direction, simply take money from that and allow, if you will, politicians just to find another way to find another pool of money and spend that. We need to do this because government doesn't need to be regulating this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, will you push for legalized sports gambling and the ability to bet via mobile devices? You have 30 seconds.
I will support the bills that the legislature pushes on this. I don't know if I'd say I would push it, but I think we need a framework to make sure that it's done right, a framework inside our already existing gambling revenues and gaming revenues in Minnesota. I would argue I trust Minnesotans. That's why I would also think that we should legalize recreational cannabis. The one thing is the revenues from sports gaming are relatively small compared to some of the other things we do. But yes, I would certainly support us doing it right, but I also know that we need to manage that from the state level.
Thank you, Governor. Justin.
We're getting a clearer picture of how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting our children's education. Federal report shows math and reading scores dropped significantly the first 2 years of the pandemic. ACT scores the lowest they've been in 30 years. So what would you do as governor to direct the state's resources and to help Minnesota's children succeed in schools? We start with Governor Walz.
What we've always done, that we prioritize them first. We fully fund our schools. We make sure they have the support. We make sure that our teachers, our parents, and our students and the support staff are there. I think we know before the pandemic and that there were things that we can do. Minnesota still ranks very near to the top. The pandemic did have it. If you conveniently forget that 1 million people died, the implications of trying to make those difficult decisions at those times, and most folks agree that those decisions save lives. With that being said, now is the time to reinvest and know what we learned. Our ability to be able to use different methods. I know this as a lifelong educator myself. Students learn at different levels. We've seen a lot during the pandemic. One of the things we saw great resiliency amongst these students. And now once we have them back in the classroom, we're doing new ways of making sure they're able to get content. I think one of the things Minnesota had the opportunity to put another $1 billion in to close the cross subsidy on special education. That deal died in May in the legislature, but we can come back and make that the case. We know in Minnesota that we see this in housing, we see it in health delivery, we see it in education. Our diversity issues on children of color, making sure that we close that gap. While Minnesota students of color do better than almost every other state, there's still a gap between white students. I think one of the biggest things we make sure that local control has the ability to be able in those school districts to make those decisions, and the state make sure that we provide the promised resources to these incredibly important our most precious resource, our children, but also making sure we deliver that. We delivered it in a manner that the results that Minnesotan parents want.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
I heard a lot of words there, but I don't quite know that they made a lot of sense. So I think Governor Walz said that people of color or students of color are doing better in Minnesota than they are in other states. I'm not certain. But I would say this. When Governor Walz says we need to fully fund education, who knows what that means? I mean, we spend 150% of what an awful lot of states already spend per student. We spend more per student than any of the other neighboring Midwestern states. At some point in time, we're going to have to ask the question, are we getting what we're paying for? We need to start funding kids, not broken institutions. Frankly, teachers understand that they could be unleashed and do so much more. The teachers aren't crazy with what the Minnesota Teachers Union is doing. We need to unleash teachers and parents and kids to work together. But we have got to deal with the fact that right now, approximately half of our kids aren't reading or doing arithmetic to grade level. Understandably, in the first couple of weeks of the pandemic, we understood that hard things would have to be done. But when Tim Walz said that 80% of kids in Minnesota miss less than 10 days of in-classroom instruction, he was basically telling the parents, you don't know what you're talking about. The fact is, they probably missed more than 100 days of school. And in the second lockdown, there was no reason for the governor to be so heavy-handed and destroy our children's education. We don't get a do-over with these kids. These kids are going to be paying the price of Tim Walz's irresponsible policy decisions for years to come.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Thank you. All right, let's go over to Stacy with a question.
One of the candidates for Nicollet County Sheriff has served that department since 1994, and he has said that they need a better plan to respond to a school shooting. The confirmed abject failure of law enforcement's response in Uvalde, Texas, weighs heavy on this entire country. What can you do as governor to make sure parents and students are confident school is a safe place to be? Dr. Jensen, this question goes to you first.
There's no question that we have got to do a better job of providing a safe place for our kids, but we also have to provide a safe place for our teachers. Both our teachers and kids are vulnerable in the school buildings, and we're seeing that more and more. Teachers are being assaulted. We're seeing kids, teachers, parents being, if you will, victimized at football games every Friday night. This is a product of a lawlessness that's swept over our state, and it started with Tim Walz delaying in May and June of 2020. He unleashed, if you will, a poisonous spread of lawlessness. Arguably, he is the godfather of the crime epidemic that has swept our country. I think what we can do with kids in school is we have to look at new things in terms of controlling access points. But we also need to recognize that the police are going to have an awful lot of expertise at how can we do this better. We need more cops on the street corners. We need restorative justice programs, and we need to respect the work police do. It isn't going to help us when we see the governor get behind Ilhan Omar when she comes out and says the police are a cancer and need to be dismantled and defunded. And a few weeks later, Tim Walz is telling Minnesota, this is the woman that we have to send to Washington, D.C. to represent us. We need to make certain that imprisoning people is a deterrent for violent felons. We absolutely need to have mandated minimum sentences, and without question, the laws have to be enforced. We can do so much better, but if we think that we can cherry pick just the schools and make them
Thank you,
safe
Dr.
when
Jensen.
everything else runs amok, we're kidding ourselves.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, we've seen this in being a teacher and having a sophomore in high school. This doesn't happen in other countries. And this plague of violence we see, and I will make the case that these school shootings of children who can't even be identified because of the damage that's been done by these shooters that end in their schools, there's things that we can do. One of the first things we can do is making sure, and every one of my budgets did increase the opportunity for public safety. We had a $450 million budget this year that was killed in the legislature when Scott told the Republican legislator to step away from that. That's money that we increased in LGA to allow for more. But it's much more than that. We have guns on the streets that were meant for war. We have the opportunity to do smart things, whether it be background checks or making sure we have red flag laws. In many of these cases, once we go back and deconstruct this, the easy access to these firearms is one of the problems. We see that in our streets today. A shooting at the Truck Park restaurant in St. Paul, the person who ended up with 2 of the guns there got them through a straw buyer who bought 90 of them in the month prior. So we have to have a conversation about guns. We have to have a conversation about fully funding our local police to get there. We need to make sure that we're doing all we can to understand that if you use a gun in a crime, it's going to be a heavy cost to it. But we need to move back upstream in the prevention of that. One, of making sure that those guns aren't on the streets, making sure we have smart policies in place.
Thank you,
And
Governor Walz.
That was my follow-up question. Who should have these military-style weapons, Dr. Jensen?
Well, the rebuttal has to be focused on who shut down the session. Tim Walz, Democratic chair in the House, confessed that the governor would not allow the Democrats to vote. Tim Walz shut down the session. Nobody else did. Tim Walz is the governor. There's only one person in this state who can call the legislature back together, and that's the governor. You're giving me an awful lot of credit, Tim, and I appreciate it. I didn't know I was so powerful that I could shut you down and you didn't even come back. You had every opportunity. And by the way, I think you better check your research.
Thank you, Dr. Walz.
And on the
Shootings in
access
schools
to
do
guns,
happen in
Dr.
places
Jensen?
other than in
Thank
the
you,
military.
Dr. Jensen, on the access to guns, your answer is?
And access to guns, I signed on to a straw man bill and I kept my name on that bill. So I agree that straw man purchases should be stiffened penalties in regards to specific types of guns. I'm a strong advocate for the Second Amendment rights. These shootings are not happening because lawful people are not following the law. These shootings are happening because lawbreakers are going to get the guns, and they're not going to go through the system.
Thank you,
so I think
Dr.
if we think
Jensen.
that that's going to solve the problem, we're kidding
And
ourselves.
Governor,
Governor Walz.
Not at all. That is untrue. And Scott's been all over like he is on every issue. The Moms Demand Action, Dr. Jensen told the group of them that you could trust his integrity. He'd be with them on the bills, and he wasn't. As far as shutting down the legislature, Dr. Jensen was in the Senate. He knows how it goes. The governor can't do this alone, and his public statements were very good. Walk away from this deal. Don't give them a win. Just so Minnesotans would know, we would have had $450 million for public safety, $1 billion for health care. $4 billion would have gone back into your pocket in the largest tax cut. As governor, I'll make sure we follow through.
thank you, Governor. We have to move along now. Moving to the next question. This year we saw soaring gas prices. Summer restrictions on cheaper E85 ethanol fuel were loosened, but drivers still felt the hit. States like California are moving to ban the sale of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. Minnesota has always followed the Golden State's emission standards, but this move has drawn serious concerns from Minnesota businesses and farmers. As governor, how do you balance the need to lower greenhouse gas emissions and keep freedom of choice for consumers? Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
That's exactly right. The market will help fix this. It's one of the reasons that I'm the national chair of the Governor's Biofuel Conference. I've been that for decades now. I've worked on it in Congress. Our future fuels are going to be made right here in Minnesota. The cars that are on the road are going to be on the road for decades. But this transition to making sure that we're addressing greenhouse gases and following where the market is going. Many of the manufacturers, GM by 2035, will only be producing those vehicles. It's why Minnesota went on the initiative to make sure that we're going to be a state that builds the infrastructure necessary for the charging stations, making sure now that Minnesotans will have a choice of over 40 vehicles rather than the 8 that they were limited to. If you don't want to buy one, don't buy one. But if you're going to buy one in Minnesota, we have the opportunity to continue to grow our economy, to continue to make that transition, to understand that that is where the market and the climate is going. Now, the good news here is from the businesses, it's a pretty limited number because we have a climate action plan that attracted almost all the major businesses in Minnesota, whether it's XL Energy producing the power, whether it's Ecolab understanding what the climate looks like, or whether it's our environmental groups that understand if Minnesota has a plan to reduce emissions, especially in the area of transportation, we have a golden opportunity. So this is a win-win-win. Our farmers produce, lead, and have been the pioneers, and I have led on so many of those initiatives on E85 and the next fuels that are coming, coupled with our transition to plug-in and hybrids. Minnesota is going to lead. We're going to have an opportunity to grow, and it's your choice what you buy.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
This is astonishing. This is just politics as usual. By forcing Minnesotans to buy electric vehicles they don't want so that in 2035 all new vehicles are electric vehicles, Governor Walz is telling Minnesotans that he's allowing you to follow the market. No, he's forcing the market. He's forcing inflationary pressures on all Minnesotans. He hasn't come up with his own tailor-made plan. He simply copied California over and over again. He put the largest biennial general budget forward last session in the history of Minnesota. It has never gone up that many dollars. He has told Minnesotans, you don't get to buy the cars you want to buy. I am going to force feed you. He has told the farmers, I am with you on biofuels. And on the other hand, he says, but we're going to completely electric vehicles, and electric vehicles don't run on biofuels. He's told the northern part of the state, you're not going to be able to mine because I don't trust you. And then he tells us that the things we need in order to have electric vehicles, we're going to produce in Minnesota. It doesn't add up. I hope you see this, people. This is crazy. Tim Walz is saying, no, you can't mine nickel and copper. He's saying to the farmers, I'm with you on biofuels, but then he says to this group, we're going to have electric vehicles and none other. He wants to get rid of internal combustion engine vehicles. You can't have it every which way. This is just a word salad with no substance.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. We will get to the issue of mining here in just a couple of moments. Let's get over to Caitlin.
I have another short answer question for you both. You'll each get 30 seconds to answer. Other than thanking them for being willing to serve in office, what is one nice thing you can say about your opponent? We'll begin with Dr. Jensen.
I've thought about this question. I think Tim Walz is an affable individual who has a wonderful smile.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, 30 seconds.
I think Scott has shown a great affinity, I see, as he talks about his family, talks about how important that is to him. I think that's always a pretty good indicator of where someone's heart's at, and I myself always appreciate that when someone puts their family first.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Let's get over to Stacy.
Agriculture is a driver of the Minnesota economy, adding more than $112 billion a year and creating more than 431,000 jobs. COVID showed us how fragile the food system is. What can you do to enforce policies to protect the state and those working within agriculture to ensure all Minnesotans have access to a safe and steady food source? Governor Walz, this question is yours first.
Well, this is an area I'm incredibly proud of, from working on farms growing up to serving 12 years and being a subcommittee ranking member in the House Agriculture Committee, passing 3 farm bills. I recognize and have deep roots and deep relationships with the people in Minnesota. We do feed, fuel, and clothe the world. We've always been on the forefront. We're making that balancing that chance between production and increasing production for a hungrier world, but also at the same time using working lands conservation. I had the opportunity to be in Worthington this last Saturday, where we dedicated a new piece of land in the middle of some of the most productive farmland in Minnesota to allow for hunting and allow for habitat. In Minnesota, some of the things that we can do is, first and foremost, we passed the most robust agricultural budget this year and provided for some of the relief that climate change is bringing. I think one of the things that we saw is we diversified our meatpacking industry. We now have opportunities for students to study meatpacking. It's one of the things my father's parents did. They had a small meat locker. I remember growing up working in that. Those are back now. We're teaching students to be able to do that. We're diversifying that, making sure that we don't have so much vertical integration. And then we're continuing to use the investments we make at the University of Minnesota and into our commodity groups to make innovations. We now drive on soy tires. We're going to see the opportunity in so many fronts to be able to use some of those value-added agricultural products. Minnesota does this incredibly well. We do it as well as anyone else, and our ag community right now is simply fundamental, as it's always been, to Minnesota's long-term growth.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
Well, Governor Walz thinks so much of agriculture that when he was on the committee in Congress, he didn't bother showing up to vote for the bill in 2018, and I think there was a newspaper in the southern portion of the state that excoriated him for his absence in determining what was going to go into that ag bill. But I think we need to do this. We need to recognize how important ag is. It's more than 30% of our economy. We need to understand that the agencies, especially under Governor Walz, have been heavy-handed. And the MPCA, the DNR, all of these agencies have got to start taking a posture where they're there to facilitate and be consultative rather than punitive. And that's a big problem. We need to understand that to grow ag, we need to know that the culture in which farmers do their business has got to improve. Regulations are killing farmers. We need to absolutely reduce taxes and make it so family farms can stay in family farms. I've made it very clear, over my dead body would I allow foreign corporations to buy family farms in Minnesota. We need to understand that treatments to the crops, to the seeds, to the soil have to be researched. We need to also understand that transportation is huge. We need to make sure the young people stay in our communities. They need to understand all the opportunities so they can connect with the workforce needs. And I think we also need to stop following California's lead. We don't need to do that. And energy is a huge issue for farmers, and I don't think we've done a good job there. We've got to be able to have more, if you will, competitive impacts, bringing better priced fuels to farmers, because diesel fuel is killing the farming industry.
Thank you,
Fertilizer
Dr.
costs as
Jensen.
well. But we've got to do better.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. As promised, now to mining. Twin Metals' controversial proposal to mine copper and nickel near the Boundary Waters was essentially killed by the Biden administration, who terminated their mineral leases following objections from environmental groups and native tribes. If a future administration wanted to reinstate those leases to then move forward with the permitting and environmental impact process, is this something you would support, and why? Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
I would absolutely support getting the mining going, particularly regarding Twin Metals. I think it's horrific what we've done with the permitting and the regulation. I think it's killing the northern part of our state, and we need those minerals. And the fact is, we've had mining in the northern part of the state for 150 years. If you want to know who stewards land best, it's the people who live there, who raise their children there, who want their grandchildren raised there. We absolutely can mine in the northern part of the state. As far as I'm concerned, we should get government out of the way and let miners mine and let loggers log and let farmers farm. But here's the rub. We're not seeing mining take place because Tim Walz has hooked his wagon to Joe Biden. And I guess with Kamala Harris coming to town on Saturday, he's hooked his wagon to her as well. And between Biden and Harris and Walz, they have absolutely squashed mining in northern Minnesota. It's killed their economy. These folks are like you and I. They just want to take care of their family, pay the bills, maybe take a vacation once in a while. But it isn't happening. This is just wrong. Can you imagine how you would feel if you had this government politician come from hundreds of miles away and tell you, you don't get to do this. The way you grew up, you don't get to do this. The job you want, you don't get to do this. Because that's what's happening. We should absolutely let miners mine.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah. First of all, a week and a half ago, I was in Keewatin with the president of U.S. Steel and the steel workers as we made the largest investment in mining in northern Minnesota in decades at the Keetac mine. We continue to make sure that we're following the science, following the law, and following the process. The idea that we just get out of the way, thank goodness I saw a bald eagle today. I'm glad the government was there to make that decision that we could work together. And I can tell you, this idea that teachers or that farmers or that miners don't want to do things right and they just want people out of the way is simply ridiculous. We know that we set standards to make sure that we keep those, and we've done that in northern Minnesota. I've been very clear on all these processes. We will follow the science, we will follow the law, and we will do that in a manner that make sure that we're able to do them safely and able to produce what we're going to produce. We followed that process in one of the largest construction projects in northern Minnesota, and we know that there's a trade-off, and you have to be careful with environmental standards, but you can create these jobs. So this idea is simply, you're hearing it a lot tonight, what's not happening are complaints rather than real solutions. Watching spades go in the ground up there and watching the Keetac mine now be solid again, making sure that those hundreds of jobs stay there. That's what our administration has done. It's the reason we have the lowest unemployment rate in the history of this country, the second highest labor participation rates, and some of the highest projections of what this state can do. If it's agriculture, if it's medical devices, if it's mining, if we can do so safely and smartly, we'll do it.
And Governor Walz, just to follow up, to be clear, if a future administration wanted to reinstate Twin Metals mineral leases to move forward with permitting and environmental impact process,
We will follow the environmental impact statements.
you would
That's what we
support
were
that?
doing during the Trump administration. We started, we did it, and that's what's been there. Our administration does what they said they're going to do, and they process according to the law.
Dan, did you ask a yes/no question?
Yes, yes, he did.
And
that
what
was
are
the
you-
answer
and
he
what's
got.
your answer?
Yes, we will follow. If they reinstate the mines, yes, we will. That's what we said.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Let's get over to Caitlin.
Minnesota has a more than $9 billion surplus. Governor Walz and Republicans couldn't come to terms on a special session to decide how to best use the money. If you become governor, what do you think should be done with the billions in our budget surplus? Governor Walz, we'll begin with you.
Just with me? Well, first of all, I'm glad that our administration was able to create this. Most of this was created by corporate profits that went through. During my term as governor, we've lowered taxes on the middle class, as I've said. We've created the largest rainy day funds. We've reduced cost in government, and we've been able to do this surplus. I agreed together with Republicans as we signed our names before they walked away that we would leave $4 billion of this on the bottom line. We would put $4 billion in middle-class tax cuts specifically aimed at the Social Security tax and renter's credit, and we would put $4 million investing in long-term care, public safety, education, and then get the matching funds for the transportation bill. It was a fair deal. It was smart. I guess they didn't want to get the win on this. What I would say on this is our plan to invest in all of things that grow Minnesota is in a real contrast to Scott's. He made the proposal that he wants to remove the income tax, which the bulk of that would go to millionaires like himself, at the same time taxing Minnesotans for clothes and food. It would also raise your property taxes. At the same time, it would gut the funding to our schools, to our transportation systems, and to things that Minnesota love. This is a real fundamental difference. I believe we invest in Minnesotans. We make targeted tax cuts in the middle class. We're proud of our progressive taxation system and our fairness in taxes, and we make sure that those who are doing well pay their fair share. What we get out of that is one of the best states for longevity, health, wellness, and the other things that come with being in Minnesota. You get what you pay for in Minnesota. I believe it's the middle class should receive those breaks, not the top.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
Well, if you get what you pay for in Minnesota, I guess Governor Walz didn't pay very much for the police, because we've got a lawlessness like we've never seen before. Let's ask ourselves some questions. First off, what's the increase in the budget over the last 11 years? 75%, from $30 billion to $52 billion. Recently, Governor Walz's proposal was, as I said before, the largest single biennial increase in dollars in the history of Minnesota. That's what he's doing. We have a $10 to $12 billion surplus, give or take. It seems to move around every couple of months. But here's the deal. If we went up 10, 12% during the biennium, and then he wants to spend another $3 or $4 billion, you are now at a 17% increase in one biennium. That is not sustainable. The average wage earner has increased 25% over the last 11 years. Government went up 75%. This is not sustainable. Governor Walz was not interested in having a bonding bill unless he got to spend more. Governor Walz's favorite tactic is to play Santa Claus and come out and say, well, I'm going to give you a check for $1,000. Isn't that nice of me? I would say this: if you would stop the waste, the fraud, the abuse, the cost overruns, and pay attention, you would save every family in Minnesota $1,000. You wouldn't have to be going out pandering like some politician who's trying to buy votes. Minnesotans get what's going on. They understand that it's in the weeks or months before the election that all of a sudden
Thank
Santa
you,
Claus
Dr.
is emerging.
Jensen. And let's get over to Justin.
If I want to give the checks to Santa
30
Claus,
seconds,
Scrooge
Governor
wants
Walz.
to keep them. So there is a choice here.
You get what you pay for.
All right, Justin.
The largest known COVID-19 fraud scheme in the nation was recently discovered here in Minnesota. Close to 50 people are facing charges for allegedly misusing $250 million in funds meant to feed children during the pandemic. My question is, what role do you feel the governor's office plays in this situation, and what steps would you take to make sure something like this doesn't happen again? Begin with Dr. Jensen.
Honestly, I think the governor's office was lazy. There were signs right out of the blocks. In fact, Governor Walz said that he was made aware of the situation in April of 2020, but then his office called the news reporter back and said, well, no, it was the summer, he misspoke. And then they called back and said it was November. But it doesn't matter when it was. The fact is the governor had every right to believe that fraud may be taking place with this Feeding Our Futures $250 million. At that point in time, according to state law, he has a responsibility to notify the Office of the Legislative Auditor. He never did that. The legislative auditor has gone on record with a letter saying that never happened. That's breaking the law. Governor Walz and his team could have stopped this anywhere along the line. But when it was getting warm in the kitchen for Governor Walz, because basically it appears that there's a cover-up, two questions are huge on all of our minds. What did Governor Walz know, and when did he know it? And here's the facts. When he was pinned down on that, he said, well, it was the judge. The judge made a bad decision. It was his fault. And then he said, when the judge came back at him in an unprecedented move, he said, well, it was the FBI. The FBI made us keep making these tens of millions of dollars of fraudulent payments because we didn't want to get in the way of their investigation. Then he made a comment about the U.S. Department of Agriculture not having the right program in place. There was a news conference within the last 48 hours pointing out that there were 5 different points where Tim Walz could have stopped this, but he didn't.
Thank you, Dr.
This
Jensen.
is laziness.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, you have 90 seconds.
Yeah, all of us can agree that fraud is unacceptable, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector. I know when we first came to office, we had the MNLARS system, some of you remember. Not fraud, but it was about $100 million of an ineffective system. We worked together bipartisanly to put that in place. We've also implemented those in many of the agencies. We've had many audits by the Office of Legislative Auditor, unprecedented audit of the governor's office just this year, released in September, as well as the Department of Health. During COVID, the federal government relaxed some of their rules, and they sent out, as they should have, aid to states in the terms of unprecedented numbers. Now, making sure those safeguards are in place, absolute priority. Once the Minnesota Department of Education found this, they alerted the FBI. Now, it's an ongoing investigation. I guess we'll get more clarity once they start to come to that. But I think one of the things that's important here, and I will note, to our hundreds of school districts and to our hundreds of honest providers, you provided food to children at a critical time in a pandemic when there were those putting out false information, internet myths, ivermectin, whatever you have. This was a life and death situation, and food security was a top priority. The vast majority of those delivered and did an incredible job, where Minnesota was ranked as the state with the most security in children's food security. So no one agrees with the fraud. We'll make sure that these people have already pled guilty. They're going to jail. They'll continue to do the investigation. We will continue to put things in place as they've already done at the federal level, rolling and putting back in some of those safeguards. And I think the after action on this is for us to strengthen those.
Rebuttal?
Yeah, I want to check in quick. Was there, you said the governor's office was lazy. Was there a step that you would take that you can stop this from happening again? I'm not sure I heard one from Governor Walz. Is there a step going forward to prevent this, and or something you would have done differently other than try harder?
I would give this, it's that intersection with the federal government to know where the payees go. I think that can be there. One of the things with the Minnesota Department of Education, when you do these types of grants, there's a grantee agency that then does it to some of the smaller ones. In this case, the grantee agency that was responsible for making sure they were overseeing this was a fraud in Feeding Our Future. So I think one of the things you do on this is working with the federal government. If it's a federal government program being administered by the state, you make sure both the federal and the state safeguards are there.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, 30 seconds to respond.
You just heard a smokescreen. You just heard a smokescreen. This is not about the federal government. This is about the state of Minnesota, and the Office of the Legislative Auditor should have been notified. The fact is, when there was a lawsuit taking place in November and December, there was tremendous opportunity for the Attorney General, for Tim Walz, to look at the checkbook to find out where these tens of millions of dollars are going, and they would see that Teslas were being bought, vacation homes were being bought. This was laziness of the most magnified degree possibly in the history of Minnesota fraud. This absolutely cannot be swept under the rug. There's a cover-up going on.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. We have to move on now. Moving now to our markets, they all cover Minnesota Minnesota outside of the Twin Cities, more rural parts of the state compared to the cities. Yet in the summer of 2020, we all watched as parts of Minneapolis burned following the murder of George Floyd. Governor Walz, looking back, what would you do differently in reaction to the protests that turned violent? And Dr. Jensen, how would you have handled that situation had you been governor? We want to begin with Governor Walz. You have 90 seconds.
Yeah, first of all, this isn't theoretical. When you're in the room, you have to make the decision. Sitting on the sidelines and critiquing, that's not what being governor is. It's making the hard decision at the time. The murder of George Floyd shocked not just Minnesota, nor the nation. It shocked the world. And the civil unrest that ensued from that was probably some of the greatest that we've seen both in this nation and globally. And that operation involving dozens of local, county, and then the state, involving multiple states in the region and involving the federal government, had to be assembled, had to be coordinated, and had to make sure that we brought order back. I'll be the first to tell you, that's terrifying for Minnesotans in those days. Nothing like this had been seen before at the level of violence after the murder of George Floyd. I think, again, there'll be stories written, and this will be written about for quite some time. I'm proud of Minnesota's response. I'm proud of Minnesota's first responders who were out there, from firefighters to police to the National Guard to citizens that were out there. When we got done with this, and President Trump's Secretary of Defense Espers wrote a book, he was on the phone many times communicating with public safety folks here, making the case. His assessment of this is that Minnesota had to write the book on this. They had to build the plane while they're flying it, and it was the model that needs to be used for every state. What I can tell you came out of that is there have been several occasions, from Derek Chauvin's trial to the murder of Daunte Wright, where the potential for this to happen again was there. It did not, because of the lessons learned and the ability to mobilize
Thank you,
that
Governor
force.
Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 90 seconds.
You heard it here. Governor Walz just told you, I am proud of Minnesota's response, referring to the riots in May and June of 2020. Wow. This isn't a one-off situation. There's a reason that the Minnesota Police and Peace Officers Association has endorsed me unanimously. Repeatedly, the pattern that has emerged is that Tim Walz denigrated the National Guard. Tim Walz didn't use them when they could have restored safety, security, and lawful behavior. And then, when confronted about it, he made some offhanded comment about a bunch of 19-year-old cooks. He didn't stand with the National Guard. On May 28th, he didn't stand with the cops. He told them, stand down. And at the state fair a couple of months ago, he says, well, that was because of the best advice of law enforcement, seeming to blame law enforcement for making that decision. A couple weeks after, 3rd Precinct burned. Christopher Columbus statues torn down. Tim Walz, stand down, State Patrol. Over and over again. Anything that has to do with lawful behavior, it seems that Tim Walz isn't there. And he yet says, I'm proud of the way Minnesota responded. Burn that into your psyche, Minnesota. Arguably, we initiated devastation
Dr.
across the
Jensen.
nation like never before.
Let me
And Tim
clarify.
Walz is proud of Minnesota's response.
And Dr.
clarify?
Jensen, I just want to ask the question again. How would you have handled that situation had you been governor at the time?
The chain of command would have kicked in right away. And we have experts. We have a commissioner of public safety. We have police chiefs in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We have Ramsey and Hennepin County. You have got to lean into these people. There were plans. There were methodologies already created that should have been kicked into gear. Tim Walz should have been using the bully pulpit to go down and help be with the people, calm the people. We should not have had TV analysts and TV journalists saying, where is our governor? This was arguably the biggest crisis we've experienced in my lifetime, and Tim Walz was absent.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Governor Walz, a chance at
Yeah, I
a
just want to be
rebuttal.
clear. I said I was proud of the first responders. You may not be, but I was. This was an incredibly difficult and unprecedented incident. There was no precedence for it before. And I want to just be clear. I have stood with the National Guard for 24 years. I'm proud of that work, that expertise that I brings to it. No matter how much I slandered by Scott, it doesn't change the fact to me. I don't care what he says about me. I care what he says about the folks who are out there doing this work, that put a plan together to deal with an unprecedented situation, to restore order in a
Thank
very
you, Governor
difficult
Walz.
time.
He means his 19-year-old cooks is what he's referring to.
We have to
Can I
move on
clarify
now.
that? Would you like to have that clarified?
Please.
The question I made on this of being a soldier and being in this is that each of us has a military occupational specialty. And Scott, like so many things, took a clip of where I said, one of the problems is in getting folks in right away. We have troops deployed all over the world. We have military occupational specialties that are trained for this. We have a small percentage of the National Guard that is trained for civil defense, not urban warfare, civil defense. And I made the case that some of us are artillerymen, some of us are pilots, some of us are ply chiefs, and some of us are newly enlisted 19-year-olds in cooks or food service. It's an important part of what we do. Having a deep understanding of the military's role and then trying to make the claim that this is somehow slanderous of someone who doesn't understand that. That's why making the case in this. I will be the first to tell you.
Governor Walz,
not everything could go perfectly.
we do have to move on.
Okay.
I see, that's how the rocks and cows, two of them go. Okay, the 19-year-olds and the
And
rocks and cows.
we do have to move along to the next question. Now, Stacy.
Let's address an issue that stands out tonight, diversity. There are no people of color in this debate, either on this panel right here or the candidates for governor. In the wake of 2020 and the social unrest experienced across Minnesota and beyond, where do you think Minnesotans are on race relations, and do you think progress is still being made? This question first to Dr. Jensen.
Well, Stacy, there's not much diversity in the audience either, but I guess that's because we don't have an audience. So having said that, I think that that was Tim Walz's choice. I think that Minnesota is absolutely committed to being the kind of marvelous state where kids get foundational educations and they're not judged by the color of their skin. I think you're seeing a rising up of minority communities saying, we're not pleased with this hyper accentuation of skin color. I'm old enough to remember that I was taught, if you see someone who looks differently than you, just forget that and just stick your hand out and make a new friend. We've absolutely corrupted the way we're educating our kids in school. We're saying that somehow some artificial parameter as to what acceptable diversity or inclusion or equity is what we have to hit. That's just not human nature. We need to keep reaching out and making new friends. We need to understand that just because you see two white guys up here on the stage tonight doesn't mean that Tim Walz or Scott Jensen are some racially biased individuals. We need to keep working on it. Minnesota's not perfect. America's not perfect. But when we see an unfairness, we have to go try to root it out. But we don't have to do it in the context of name calling, where all of a sudden, well,
Thank you, Dr. Jensen.
Of note, Dr. Jensen, we are confined to a TV station studio here, so for space, there is no audience. Governor Walz, your answer to where do you think Minnesotans are on race relations and where are we headed?
It's a work in progress. It's 160 years, whether it be the indigenous communities here that were subjugated, whether it's boarding schools or land confiscated. We're still working on that. I'm proud of our administration. I'm proud of Lieutenant Governor Flanagan, the first indigenous person to assume an executive office. I'm proud that our judicial appointments start to reflect and look like the state. And I'll tell you what I'm really proud of is our schools. I continue to hear Scott denigrate our schools, black holes, they're terrible, they're not working, and then just vicious black internet rumors about things. That's not who we are. We're a state of immigrants that values that. We have more refugees per capita than any other state. That's not just morally a good thing. It's our economic and cultural future. This beautiful diversity we see out in Worthington when I'm there, you see 50 languages spoken in the school, and you see every storefront filled with different types of foods, different types of businesses that are happening. Minnesota needs to continue to do that. The office of governor can set the tone on that. That's why when Scott said that immigrants are undermining the fabric of our state, that's the type of talk that turns people away. We're going to need to continue to attract people here. We're going to continue to need to diversify. We're going to have to put policies in place that make sure we're attracting teachers of color so that students of color have someone that they understand, look like, think like, see like in front of them, as well as other students. We are doing it in Minnesota, but I can tell you, George Floyd sparked that conversation, and it's
Thank
still
you, Governor
happening.
Walz.
Rebuttal.
And, well, we
I think
do
that
have to move
immigrants
along.
are the
Constrained
fabric
on
of
time.
our.
We want to get to this final question before we wrap up tonight.
Okay.
There are a million topics we could have talked about tonight. We just simply don't have the time. People will assume a lot of things simply by seeing the R or the DFL next to your name. So in 30 seconds, are there any topics where you think your party has it wrong or where you differ from the typical Republican or DFLer? We'll start with Governor Walz.
Yeah, I think on biofuels and some of our agricultural work, I've always been some of an outlier. I was one of the few Democratic members of Congress who was on the Ag Committee. I'm the one who has support of statewide agricultural groups, and there's friends, deep friendships in there of understanding this. And I think our party could do a better job of listening, reaching out, understanding these policies, and trying to find that common ground.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen.
I think, frankly, the Republican Party has plenty of room for improvement, and I'm proud of the fact that we're recognizing it. We need to do a better job of elevating and honoring the issues and concerns that moms have. We need to do a better job of going to the minority communities and asking them what's important, because when we do, they belong with us. They want to elevate faith and family and freedom and life. We need to do a better job of going to millennials and Gen Zs and saying, we need your help solving problems. We need to go to immigrants and say, you are the fabric of our future. We want you with us. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. All right, it's time to get to our closing statements here. This hour has gone very quickly. Each of you are going to get 2 minutes for those closing statements based on the coin toss before the debate. Governor Walz, you will go first.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank Scott for his participation. Again, great TV and our moderators. And to you out there, I know there's a big audience out there. I know you care about this state. You get a choice here of a vision of Minnesota, one that questions our elections, one that tells women they can't make their choices, one that defunds our public schools, or you get an opportunity that brought so many of us to Minnesota, an opportunity for a state that is inclusive, an opportunity in a state that, you know what, we do spend a little bit more on health care. We do spend a little bit more on education. We do spend a little bit more on our roads. We've got the 4th largest amount of roads in the country, behind California, Texas, and Illinois. We know that you invest in the future, that's what comes back to you tenfold over. Our children are fundamental to us. Investing in fully funding education and making sure they have the best start is what we can do. Making sure we're investing in the workforce of the future. Business community knows we're going to have to tackle this issue. We do have the lowest unemployment rate, and most of our people work. We need to attract people here by being a state that is welcoming, by being a state that says, you know what, we're going to help figure out this crisis around child care. And it's a state that says, you know what, when problems come up, it's not enough just to complain about them. We've seen it across the country, we've seen it here. We should have zero tolerance on crime. We should invest the money that we know we need to invest, and we need to collaborate together. And then we should make smart policies, making sure we keep dangerous military weapons out of the hands of our children, making sure we're continuing to invest in innovation at the University of Minnesota and our state colleges systems and our local community colleges. Those are the ways that Minnesota's come together. I've talked a lot about One Minnesota. I didn't come up with that. That's what we believe, whether it's mining on the Iron Range, whether it's farming in southern Minnesota, or whether it's a job in the Twin Cities. Folks who try and divide us apart aren't going to do it. This is our opportunity to learn from what's happened, to come out of the pandemic, and to create a Minnesota that everybody can thrive in. I hope I can earn your vote.
Thank you, Governor Walz. Dr. Jensen, you have 2 minutes.
Everyone I see across the state, north, south, east, west, has endured some pretty trying times. I think everyone's felt some heartbreak from watching people's lives turned upside down. And I think everybody has grasped at some level that Tim Walz has failed. It got away from him. He tried, he repeated mistakes, he funneled active COVID-19 disease into nursing homes, he locked down businesses, he locked out kids, he locked in frail elderly. The question is, who's going to step forward? Who's going to try to find a new path for Minnesota? Clearly, we're not One Minnesota. Who is going to help Minnesota find its way back to be the bright, shining star of the North, to be that economic hub of the Midwest? You Minnesotans have the opportunity to do this. You have the power to take back your rights. You have the power to turn your agencies, instead of being heavy-handed, punitive agencies, whether you're talking the DNR or the Met Council, whether you're talking the MPCA, you have the ability to step forward. We need to stand up together. We need to recognize that Matt Burke and Scott Jensen are not professional politicians. We will make mistakes. We will use words that we should have chosen a different word. I will make mistakes, to be sure. But at the end of the day, I will take the slings and the arrows. I will get bruised and bloodied, and I have. I have never had anybody spend $15 million to denigrate my name. But it is what it is. I get it. I've been Family Doctor of the Year, and I've started businesses and built clinics. I've been on school board and president of the Church Council and the Rotary and the Lions. I've always been a measured person. To be called extreme has been an unusual experience for me. But this time around, I want you and I and Matt Burke to stand in the arena side by side. I want us to go forward, and I want us to heal Minnesota.
All right, thank you both. That is our time for tonight. We appreciate Governor Tim Walz and Dr. Scott Jensen for their time and answers. Thanks, of course, to our colleagues from Valley News Live, KEYC News Now, and Northern News Now. Early voting is currently underway, and Election Day is November 8th. Thanks so much for watching.
Of course, he came out of a very, very divisive primary. A lot of money was spent against him. And so as he's been able to get on air and raise that money and really